Hey everyone, Kevin here in the JCR Off-Road Garage. In today's video, we're going to be installing our skid system, including the engine, transmission, and transfer case skid on our 4th generation Ford Ranger. We're going to start out here under the truck. So before our skid can be installed, the factory skid or bash plates, if you will, need to be removed. This is a 2-piece setup here on the truck that we're replacing with a 1-piece skid plate. We'll start by actually removing this smaller rear section back here. For all of the mounting hardware on this, you're going to need a 15mm socket and some sort of impact or a ratchet, whatever works for you. And we'll start by just loosening the 2 bolts here in the center. The reason for that is that this is just slotted on both ends of these skids. So we'll now remove the back 2 way back in here, and then this should be able to kind of just drop and slide back and out. With that down and out of the way, we can get this front section off. So you'll now remove the 2 front bolts here, making sure you have the skid supported while you pull the last one out. And then kind of just like that rear half, this should now slide forward and then down off the vehicle. From there, just make sure you come back and now remove those 2 bolts toward the center. With all that down out of the way, here is a quick look at the skid you're going to be installing. So this does pretty much use all the same factory mounting locations up there with new provided hardware. The only real difference comes with this kind of rear left side hole, where you are going to have to install the provided square washer along with 7/16 nut up into the frame cross member just before this goes in. So we'll show you that, and then we'll get this jacked into place using our transmission jack. In our case, if you're doing this on the ground in your driveway or your garage, you can kind of achieve the same thing with a floor jack and maybe even the help of a friend, just due to kind of the large nature of this skid. So grabbing that square washer and that nut, we're going to be working at the left-hand side of this rear lower control arm cross member. Basically, you're going to take the square washer and slide it up into the center cross member and push it all the way over to line up with this oval hole, kind of the second hole in from the side. You should kind of start to see it lining up there, and then you can use your finger or a screwdriver to center it up on that hole. After that, you'll want to grab some sort of screwdriver or pick that fits inside of that nut. You can push it all the way through the top of the cross member, and then up top you can drop the nut on, let it fall down through the hole, and it should line up pretty well on top of that large square washer. Now we can grab our skid and get it into position. Now as you're raising this into position, it's a good idea to have at least some of your hardware handy. So these are going to be the 10mm hex head bolts in your bolt pack, along with washers kind of already installed on there. If you're installing this with our JCR Front Crusader, you're going to be using the button head hardware in your bolt pack in just these front 2 hole locations. And for those, you should need a 3/16 hex, but here you're going to be using a 17mm socket or wrench. So then it's just a matter of jacking this up and getting it in a place where you can line up and start this hardware. And once we get these started up here, we'll work our way through and start all our hardware before tightening anything. With that 17mm socket, ideally a shallow 17 and a couple more of those 10mm bolts with washers, you can now start your center hardware here. You're just going to reach up with the bolt already installed kind of in the socket. You'll reach through these holes. You can kind of peek over the side here. Obviously you guys won't be able to see that part on camera as it does get a little bit tight in there, but you can make sure those are lined up visually and then start these. With those 4 bolts started, the skid should be pretty well supported, so we can get our jack down and out of the way and then move on to that rear hardware. Moving now to the back side of the skid, the center and right side hole here will get 2 more of those 10mm bolts, and then you'll find the 7/16 by 1 inch long hex head bolt with a washer to go in this left side hole. So kind of using the same short socket trick with our 5/8 socket now, you can reach through the top of that cross member and kind of feel for the nut that we installed earlier with that square washer. And then reaching up through here, you can line up the 2 and get this outside bolt started. Once you have all of your mounting hardware tight, if this engine skid is the only skid you're installing at this time, you can just work your way back through and tighten everything up. Since we are installing our full skid system along with our transmission and transfer case skid, we're going to leave this loose so that we have some extra side-to-side adjustment here as we're getting the transmission skid installed, which is going to mount in these 2 holes. Now, since the transmission skid mounts to this rear transmission mount cross member, we also have to come back here real quick and remove this kind of small transfer case skid from the factory. This is just going to be 4 bolts that also require our 15mm socket, much like those front skids. The 2 out here on the side are slotted, so just like before, you can loosen these 2, remove the bolts here, and get the skid out of the way, and then come back and fully remove those. With that down and out of the way, we can move back up to that rear lower control arm cross member, where we'll need to slip in a couple more square washers and nuts to secure the front of the skid. So back up here, you kind of know this story from this outside mounting hole on the left side of that engine skid. So you'll take the square washer. The only difference here is you're now using a 1/2 inch nut, and you're sliding it in to line up with this outside hole. And then you'll do the same thing over on the passenger side and the outside hole over here. You can then move back to the rear transmission cross member. You'll want to find the provided nut plate that I have here. If you look at it in this orientation, you'll see it does have a cutout on one end. That's going to go toward the front of the vehicle with the pre-installed nuts up, as they're going to slide into some of the holes on this cross member. With that kind of loosely in place, you'll be looking for the kind of front to rear slotted holes, 1 on each side of this nut plate, and that will help you identify where you're going to install the 3.5 inch long 7/16 bolts with washers. These will go from the top down, so I will have to set this off to the side for just a moment. As you go to install these bolts, you'll want to grab another pair of the black square washers like we used earlier on. You'll put 1 on each of the bolts, and then in this case here on the passenger side, you're going to have to lift up on this exhaust pipe as you slide this down in. It is on a rubber mount over here, so moving that just a little bit is not really an issue, and then you can just let that hang and do the same thing in the driver's side location. Again, on the driver's side, just reference that nut plate if you're trying to figure out the hole location here, but when installing this, it should wind up kind of just to the outside of the front drive shaft. With those hanging, you can again grab that nut plate along with 2 7/16 nuts to go on these bolts. You'll slide it into place with the bolts dropping down through, and then you may have to just kind of reach over the top to temporarily hold that bolt while you thread the nut on. Do the same thing over here. With both of those started and kind of threaded hand tight, you'll grab a 5/8 and 11/16 wrench. The 5/8 will be for the bolt head side, 11/16 for the nut, and you can tighten both sides of this up. So real quick, you can get a look at the skid here. The narrower end that you can see there is going to go toward the front, and the wider end then is left to go toward the rear. You are looking at it from the top, so we want these standoffs to go up against the frame of the vehicle. And then you're going to install this with 4 1/2 inch bolts. You will, however, have 2 different lengths, so the shorter of the 2 is going to go in the rear, leaving the longer ones to go up front. With that being said, we'll now throw this on our transmission jack, just like we did that front skid, and lift it into position. So with the skid lifted up into position, you're going to be lining the rear of it up with the 2 outside nuts on this nut plate. You're also going to have to grab a 3/4 socket to install these 1/2-inch bolts. And it's just a matter of getting this lined up and getting your hardware started in all 4 corners before you tighten it in place. So nothing too special to note on the front side of things, just that if you need to, you can reach through the side of that cross member where you installed the square washer and the nut. That will allow you to hold the nut as you get this bolt started. And then if necessary, you can also slip a wrench through here to hold that nut when tightening things. Once you get all 4 bolts in, holding that transmission skid in place, if this is where you're stopping, you're only doing engine and transmission skid at this time, this is where you can now come back and tighten up all your engine and transmission skid hardware, just kind of paying attention to the small gaps between the 2 skids, right where they key in together here, making sure they're nice and even as you tighten things up. Now, if you are continuing on with a TK skid at this time, again, just leave this transmission skid loose and come back through, tighten everything up at the end. Now we can move on to our transfer case skid plate. This one, you're going to need to also grab a 9/16 socket to go along with what you got out, and a drill and some good sharp drill bits. Let's get started. So under here, as you lift it into position, it's going to key into the back of the transmission skid that we just installed, and you'll start 2 1/2-inch hex bolts into that nut plate that we installed earlier on as well. These are going to be the larger bolts in your bolt pack, as well as the larger 2 washers. And then we'll just maneuver this as needed and get them started. Switching then to your 17mm socket, you'll find the 2 10mm hex bolts with washers. These are going to go in the 2 driver's side holes over here on the left side of your skid. So go ahead and line those up and get these started. Once you have those 4 bolts started, come back and take a look at the gap between your T-case and transmission skid, kind of even everything up there, and then you can lightly snug this one into place, and that way it'll be held tight while we drill the holes on the passenger side. Then coming over here to the passenger side, you're going to have 2 more slotted holes that line up here on the frame. They're not going to line up with any holes, however, so this is where we need to drill. Here, obviously, I have a center punch. This is just a spring punch. You could also use a conventional punch with a hammer, but you're going to mark 2 holes, basically center of the slot is what you're looking for here. If you're drilling holes, you're obviously going to need a drill. I'm starting out with an 1/8-inch drill bit just to get a nice pilot hole here and know that we can get it centered up in that slot on our center punch mark. So we'll drill both of those. Now in these holes, we're going to be installing 3/8 thread cutting bolts. So the pilot hole size for those is going to be 5/16. Here I have just a step bit or unibit, if you will. I've got it marked out kind of really clearly with my gold Sharpie, just so I don't over drill and I kind of know where to stop. You could achieve the same thing by just using a standard 5/16 drill bit. So here I have one of those thread cutting bolts. They're pretty easily identifiable by the cutting notch built into the start of that threaded end, as well as the small flange on the hex head side. Even though this has a small flange, we're going to add a slightly larger 3/8 washer in here. And then you're going to need an impact with a 9/16 socket. You'll want to press this into your pilot hole, and then you'll apply a little bit of pressure to the back of your impact as you run these in tight. Once you have both of these tight, you can now run back through and tighten up the hardware for this skid, as well as any hardware on the transmission and engine skid that you've left loose to this point. From there, one thing I will mention, just due to the way the skids mount and the way they kind of share mounting in a couple locations, you may have a little bit of additional hardware left over. That's not a concern as long as you have hardware mounted in all of these bolt hole locations the way we've shown you throughout the video. But if you do still have any questions about that or anything else related to this product or any other JCR product, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always call us at 269-353-1184 or email us at info@jcroffroad.com.